A group of black teens faces racial profiling while performing Christmas carols at a mall to raise money for a homeless shelter. What begins as humiliation turns into a powerful movement when their story goes viral, sparking conversations about bias and unity. Through music and determination, they transform their pain into purpose, proving that even small voices can inspire lasting change. Write in the comment where you're watching this video from. The Willow Grove Mall buzzed with the hum of holiday excitement. Shoppers scurried from store to store, their arms heavy with bags wrapped in festive colors. A towering Christmas tree glittered in the mall's central atrium, its gold and red ornaments catching the light like tiny suns. A choir of animatronic elves near Santa's village sang carols on a loop, their mechanical cheer blending into the ambient noise of ringing cash registers and murmured conversations. Tyrell adjusted the strap of his guitar case as he stepped off the bus with Jasmine, Malik, Danny, and Aaliyah trailing behind. The winter air bit at their cheeks, but the teenagers hardly noticed. This was the day they'd been preparing for over the past month, performing Christmas carols to raise money for the local homeless shelter. It wasn't just a performance for them. It was a way to give back to their community, a community that had faced its fair share of hardships. "You ready for this?" Jasmine asked, nudging Tyrell as they approached the mall entrance. She had a voice like velvet, rich and smooth, and was the group's lead vocalist. "As ready as I'll ever be," Tyrell replied, flashing a grin. His confidence was steady, but a flicker of doubt lingered in his eyes. This wasn't just about singing. It was about proving something to themselves, to the community, and to anyone who underestimated them. The group stepped inside, welcomed by a blast of warm air and the overwhelming aroma of cinnamon pretzels. They were dressed casually but neatly, each carrying their instruments or sheet music. The plan was simple. Meet Mrs. Lopez, their organizer, at the mall office to finalize details before heading to their performance spot near the atrium. As they made their way through the bustling crowd, a pair of watchful eyes followed them. Officer McAllister, the head of mall security, leaned against the railing on the second floor, sipping his lukewarm coffee. He was a stocky man in his late 50s, with a face permanently set in a frown. McAllister prided himself on keeping the mall safe during the busy holiday season, though his definition of safety often veered into suspicion. "Troublemakers," he muttered to himself, watching the teens weave through the crowd. His hand hovered over the radio clipped to his belt. "Why do they always travel in packs?" McAllister's junior officer, a fresh-faced recruit named Jenkins, glanced at the group and then at his boss. "They don't look like trouble to me," Jenkins said cautiously. "They've got instruments. Maybe they're performers." McAllister snorted. "Performers don't show up looking like that. Trust me, Jenkins, I've been doing this job long enough to know when someone's up to no good. Let's keep an eye on them." Down below, the teens stopped near a bench to regroup. Danny, a petite girl with a mischievous smile, pulled out her phone to check the time. "Mrs. Lopez said to meet her at 2:30, right? We're a little early." "Yeah, let's just chill here for a minute," Malik said, setting his cajon drum on the ground and sitting on it. He was the quietest of the group, but his beats were the backbone of their music. As they chatted, laughing and joking about their rehearsal mishaps, McAllister descended the escalator, his gaze fixed on them like a hawk. He approached slowly, his boots clicking against the tiled floor. "Excuse me," he said, his voice sharp. The teens looked up, startled. "What are you kids doing here?" "We're here for the charity carol performance," Tyrell said, stepping forward. His tone was polite but firm. "We're supposed to meet our organizer in the office upstairs." McAllister's eyes narrowed. "Charity carol performance? I haven't heard anything about that." "It's on the schedule," Jasmine interjected, pulling up the email on her phone. "Mrs. Lopez cleared it with mall management weeks ago." The officer didn't even glance at the phone. "Well, I haven't been informed, and I can't just have groups of kids hanging around causing disruptions. You'll need to move along." "Move along," Danny echoed, her temper flaring. "We're not loitering. We're here to help raise money for the shelter." McAllister's frown deepened. Don't get smart with me, young lady. This is private property, and I have the right to ask anyone to leave if I think they're causing trouble. Trouble? Aaliyah said, her voice incredulous. She instinctively reached for her phone, starting to record the interaction. We're literally here to sing Christmas carols. I don't appreciate that tone, McAllister snapped, his hand moving to the radio on his belt. Either you leave now, or I'll have you escorted out. At this point, a small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the raised voices. Shoppers whispered among themselves, their gazes flitting between the teens and the officer. Is there a problem here? Jenkins asked as he approached, his expression uneasy. He glanced at the crowd, clearly uncomfortable with the scene unfolding. They were loitering and refused to leave when asked, McAllister said curtly. I'm handling it. We're not loitering, Tyrell said again, his voice steady but edged with frustration. We're scheduled to perform. Can we please just go to the office and sort this out? Not without an escort, McAllister said, signaling Jenkins to step forward. Let's go. Reluctantly, the teens followed the officers toward the mall office, their humiliation palpable. Whispers trailed behind them as shoppers speculated about what had happened. Inside the office, Mrs. Lopez was already waiting, her face lighting up when she saw the teens. There you are. I was starting to. She froze as McAllister and Jenkins stepped in behind them. What's going on? These kids were loitering, McAllister said gruffly. I was escorting them out. Loitering? Mrs. Lopez's eyes widened. They're here for the charity carol performance. I cleared this with management weeks ago. McAllister blinked, clearly taken aback, but his expression quickly hardened. I wasn't informed. Well, now you are, Mrs. Lopez said, her tone clipped. Thank you for bringing them here, but I'll take it from here. McAllister hesitated, his pride visibly stung. Fine, he muttered, turning on his heel. Jenkins shot the teens an apologetic look before following his superior out. Are you all okay? Mrs. Lopez asked once the door closed. We're fine, Tyrell said, though the tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise. Just frustrated. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Lopez said, her face clouded with concern. Let's get everything set up and focus on the performance. Okay? Don't let this ruin your day. The teens nodded, though the sting of the encounter lingered. As they headed back toward the atrium to set up their instruments, Tyrell caught sight of McAllister watching them from the second floor. His arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Deck the malls, huh? Danny muttered under her breath, her voice dripping with sarcasm. What a start. Tyrell forced a smile, though his fists clenched at his sides. Let's show them what we're here for. As they began setting up, their spirits slowly lifted. Jasmine started humming, Oh Holy Night, her voice floating through the air like a bomb. Malik tapped out a soft rhythm on his drum, and Danny joined in with a few harmonized notes. By the time they finished their soundcheck, they were ready to prove that they belonged, and that no one could silence their voices. The tension from earlier still lingered, but it was outweighed by something stronger: determination. The teens' frustration began to dissipate as they finished setting up near the grand Christmas tree in the atrium. The sound of their warm-up filled the air, soft but melodic, drawing the attention of passing shoppers. A few people paused to watch, their expressions curious and, in some cases, impressed. Let's take 5 before Mrs. Lopez gets back, Jasmine suggested, brushing a strand of curly hair from her face. She had already begun to hum a few bars of Silent Night, her voice effortlessly finding its rhythm. The group agreed, and they headed toward the food court, where the tantalizing smell of cinnamon rolls and buttery pretzels wafted through the air. Tyrell glanced at the clock on his phone as they walked. They had a little over 20 minutes before their scheduled performance. The food court was packed, as it always was during the holiday season. Families clustered around tables, balancing trays piled high with fast food. Workers on their lunch breaks scarfed down meals before heading back to their shifts. Somewhere in the background, a baby wailed, the sound blending seamlessly into the holiday chaos. I'm starving, Malik said, eyeing a stall selling burgers and fries. "Anybody else want something?" "I could eat," Danny said, already pulling out her wallet. "Let's split up and meet back here in 10 minutes. The group agreed and dispersed, pairing off to hit different vendors. Aaliyah stayed behind, scrolling through her phone and reviewing the recording of their earlier confrontation with McAllister. She debated whether to upload it right away or wait until after the performance. Meanwhile, on the second floor, McAllister leaned against the railing, his sharp eyes scanning the food court. He spotted the teens almost immediately, scattered among the crowd. They weren't doing anything wrong, just waiting in line for food, but his instincts told him otherwise. "See that?" McAllister said, nudging Jenkins, who stood beside him. "This is what I was talking about." Jenkins followed his gaze. "They're just grabbing food. Isn't that normal?" "It's not what they're doing. It's how they're doing it," McAllister replied, his tone tinged with suspicion. "They're splitting up, moving separately. That's how they get away with things." Jenkins frowned. "Get away with what, sir?" "They've been nothing but respectful." McAllister gave him a pointed look. "You've got a lot to learn, kid. Stay sharp." Back in the food court, Tyrell and Jasmine returned first, carrying trays loaded with fries and sodas. They found a small table and sat down, chatting casually while they waited for the others. Tyrell tried to shake the lingering discomfort from their earlier encounter, but couldn't help glancing over his shoulder now and then. "You okay?" Jasmine asked, noticing his unease. "Yeah," Tyrell said, though his tone wasn't convincing. "I just don't like the way that guy looked at us. Like we were criminals or something." Jasmine sighed. "I know, but let's focus on the music. That's why we're here." Before Tyrell could respond, Danny and Malik returned, balancing their own trays of food. "Where's Aaliyah?" Danny asked, looking around. "She stayed back at the table," Jasmine said. "She'll probably join us in a minute." But Aaliyah didn't join them. Instead, she stayed seated near the food court's edge, her phone still in her hand. She felt a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, as if someone was watching her. When she glanced up, she locked eyes with McAllister, who was now descending the escalator. "Not this guy again," Aaliyah muttered under her breath, pressing the record button on her phone. McAllister approached the group's table, his boots clicking against the floor. By now, Danny, Malik, Tyrell, and Jasmine had all noticed him. Their cheerful conversation faltered as his shadow fell over them. "Is there a problem?" Tyrell asked, his tone calm but firm. "Yeah, there is," McAllister said, crossing his arms. "I told you kids not to loiter. Now you're taking up space in the food court without even buying anything." "We did buy food," Malik said, gesturing to the trays on the table. "See for yourself." McAllister glanced at the trays but didn't seem convinced. "Doesn't matter. You've been moving around in a way that's disruptive to other patrons." "Disruptive?" Danny said, her voice rising. "We're literally sitting here, eating, just like everyone else." "Keep your voice down," McAllister snapped. "I don't want to have to ask you again." Aaliyah stood up from her seat and walked over, her phone still recording. "You're really doing this again?" she said, her voice steady but sharp. "What exactly do you think we're doing wrong?" McAllister glared at her. "Put that phone away." "No," Aaliyah said simply. "I'm recording this because you're targeting us for no reason." By now, other diners in the food court had begun to notice the exchange. Whispers rippled through the crowd as heads turned in their direction. "Sir," Jenkins said quietly, stepping up beside McAllister, "maybe we should just let this go. They're not doing anything wrong." "Stay out of it, Jenkins," McAllister growled. Then, turning back to the teens, he said, "You have two options. Leave the food court now, or I'll call backup to have you removed from the premises." "Are you serious?" Jasmine said, her voice quivering with anger. "We're here to sing Christmas carols for charity, and you're treating us like criminals." "Enough," McAllister said. He reached for his radio, but before he could speak into it, a new voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Mrs. Lopez appeared, her face flushed from hurrying over. She glanced between McAllister and the teens, immediately understanding the situation. "These kids are with me," she said firmly. "They're performers for the charity event, scheduled and approved by mall management." "What exactly is the issue?" McAllister hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "They were being disruptive," he said, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "They were eating lunch," Mrs. Lopez said, her tone icy. "And even if they weren't, there's no rule against sitting in the food court. If there's a problem here, it's you harassing them." The crowd murmured in agreement, emboldened by Mrs. Lopez's words. McAllister's face turned red, but he said nothing. He gave the group one last glare before turning on his heel and walking away, with Jenkins trailing behind. "Are you all okay?" Mrs. Lopez asked, her eyes scanning the teens for signs of distress. "We're fine," Tyrell said, though his jaw was clenched. "But this is getting ridiculous." "I know," Mrs. Lopez said, her voice softening. "Let's just focus on the performance. Don't let him ruin this for you." The group nodded, but the mood was noticeably darker as they made their way back to the atrium. Aaliyah stopped to upload the recording to her social media, captioning it, "Mall security targeting us again. All we want to do is sing carols for charity. Share if you think this is wrong." By the time they reached their performance area, the video was already gaining views. Tyrell set down his guitar case, his mind racing. He wanted to focus on the music, but a part of him couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath the surface. "This is more than just us," he said quietly to Jasmine as they tuned their instruments. "People need to know what's happening." "They will," Jasmine said, her voice resolute. "Let's start by showing them what we're really here for." The atrium's central stage, nestled in front of the colossal Christmas tree, was set up with a modest sound system and a few chairs for the performers. The teens gathered their instruments and warmed up, their earlier frustration still simmering but hidden beneath a veil of professionalism. Shoppers milled about nearby, some pausing to glance at the group with mild curiosity. Mrs. Lopez handed Tyrell a microphone. "Remember," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "focus on the music. You're here to make a difference, not to let people like McAllister get in your way." Tyrell nodded, gripping the mic tightly. "We've got this," he said, though a part of him wondered if he was saying it more to convince himself than anyone else. As the teens took their positions, Jasmine stepped forward, her natural charisma drawing attention even before she began to sing. She adjusted the mic stand, took a deep breath, and nodded to Malik, who started tapping out a soft rhythm on his cajon drum. The opening notes of "O Holy Night" filled the atrium, Jasmine's voice soaring with a rich, velvety tone that instantly silenced the low hum of conversation. Shoppers turned toward the stage, drawn in by the music's unexpected beauty. A few began filming on their phones, capturing the performance as the other teens joined in with harmonized backing vocals. For a moment, the tension of the day melted away. The music became their shield, their escape, and their statement. Danny plucked delicate notes on her violin, adding a haunting elegance to the carol. Tyrell strummed his guitar with practiced ease, his fingers moving instinctively as he kept his focus on Jasmine's voice. By the time they reached the song's crescendo, a small crowd had gathered near the stage, applauding enthusiastically when the final note faded into the air. "You hear that?" Jasmine said softly, a smile creeping onto her face. "That's what we're here for." Tyrell grinned, but before he could respond, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a flood of notifications from social media. Aaliyah's video of their earlier encounter had started to go viral, with hundreds of shares and a growing number of comments. "Hey!" Aaliyah whispered, nudging him. "Look at this." She held up her phone, showing a comment thread beneath the video. Messages of support poured in, mixed with angry reactions toward McAllister's behavior. "This is disgusting. Why are they being treated like this?" One comment read, "Shame on the mall for allowing this kind of discrimination during the holidays." But there were also dissenting voices. "We don't know the full story. Maybe security had a reason to step in. They're probably exaggerating. Teenagers always play the victim." Tyrell's jaw tightened. "Let's focus on the next song," he said, setting the phone aside. "We'll deal with that later." The group launched into their next carol, Joy to the World, their voices blending in perfect harmony. The crowd continued to grow, with parents lifting their children onto their shoulders for a better view. Even a few mall employees paused in the middle of their shifts to listen, their faces lighting up as the music infused the air with holiday spirit. But not everyone was captivated. From the shadows near the edge of the atrium, McAllister stood with his arms crossed, his expression dark. Jenkins hovered nearby, looking increasingly uncomfortable. "See what I mean?" McAllister muttered. "They're stirring up the crowd." Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "Sir, they're performing Christmas carols. That's not exactly stirring up the crowd." McAllister ignored him, his focus shifting to the growing audience. To him, the teens' presence was disruptive, a challenge to the mall's order. He glanced at the security radio clipped to his belt, contemplating his next move. The teens finished their second song to another round of applause. Jasmine stepped forward again, her confidence growing with each performance. "Thank you, everyone," she said into the mic, her voice bright and genuine. "We're here today to spread holiday cheer and raise money for the Willow Grove Homeless Shelter. If you'd like to contribute, there's a donation box right here." Several people stepped forward to drop bills into the box, their faces warm with gratitude. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, holding out a crumpled $5 bill. She smiled and handed it to him, letting him place it in the box himself. "You're making a difference," Mrs. Lopez whispered to Tyrell, her eyes glistening. "This is what it's all about." Tyrell nodded, his heart swelling with pride. But the moment was short-lived. As the group began their next song, McAllister stepped forward, his voice cutting through the music like a blade. "That's enough," he said loudly, causing several heads to turn. Jasmine faltered mid-verse, her voice trailing off in confusion. The other teens stopped playing, their instruments falling silent. "What's the problem now?" Tyrell asked, stepping forward to shield his friends. "You're causing a disturbance," McAllister said, his tone cold. "This is a shopping mall, not a concert venue." "We're here with permission," Mrs. Lopez said, her voice rising in frustration. "This event was approved by management." "I wasn't informed," McAllister said, his face reddening. "And it doesn't matter. You're blocking foot traffic and making it difficult for shoppers to move freely." The crowd murmured in disagreement, a few people shouting protests. "They're not blocking anything," a woman called out. "They're performing for charity." "Leave them alone," another voice added, earning scattered applause. McAllister's expression hardened. "I'm going to have to ask you all to leave," he said, addressing the teens. "Are you kidding me?" Aaliyah said, her phone already raised to record the exchange. "You're kicking us out for singing Christmas carols?" "This is harassment," Mrs. Lopez said, stepping closer to McAllister. "You're out of line." "Ma'am, I suggest you back off," McAllister snapped. "This is mall policy." "No, it's not," a new voice said. The crowd parted as the mall's general manager, a tall woman in a sharp blazer, strode forward. Her face was a mix of irritation and disbelief. "What's going on here?" she demanded. "These kids are disrupting the shopping experience," McAllister said, gesturing toward the group. "That's not what I see," the manager replied, crossing her arms. "I see a crowd of happy shoppers enjoying a beautiful performance, and I see my head of security overstepping his bounds." McAllister opened his mouth to argue, but she cut him off. "You and I will be having a conversation later," she said sharply. Then, turning to the teens, she smiled warmly. "Please, continue your performance. You're doing a wonderful job." The crowd erupted into cheers, and McAllister stalked off, his face a mask of fury. As the teens resumed their carols, their voices were stronger than ever, fueled by the support of the audience. They sang with all their hearts, determined to turn the day's challenges into a triumph. By the time they finished their final song, the donation box was overflowing, and the applause was deafening. For a moment, they forgot about McAllister, the confrontation, and the tension. All that mattered was the music, and the difference they had made. Back at the community center, the atmosphere was tense as the teens and Mrs. Lopez settled into one of the meeting rooms. The walls were decorated with holiday crafts from the center's younger participants, but the cheerful snowmen and glittery ornaments did little to lighten the group's mood. The earlier confrontation with McAllister lingered like a bad taste. Tyrell leaned forward, elbows on the table, his hands clasped tightly. "What just happened today? It's not right. I can't stop thinking about it. We were there to do something good, and instead we got treated like criminals. We're not the first ones it's happened to, either," Aaliyah added, her phone in hand. She'd been scrolling through the comments on her uploaded video, her expression growing more frustrated by the second. "Look at this. So many people are saying they've had similar experiences. Being harassed just for existing in spaces they're not supposed to be in." "Let me see that," Mrs. Lopez said, holding out her hand. Aaliyah passed her the phone, and Mrs. Lopez skimmed the comments. "It's not surprising," she said softly, setting the phone down. "But it's heartbreaking." Malik sighed, staring at the table. "I don't get it. Why is it always like this? We're just kids trying to do something good. How can anyone see us as a threat?" "It's not about us," Jasmine said, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "It's about what we represent to people like him. It doesn't matter what we do. Some people just see us as trouble." The room fell silent for a moment. Even the distant chatter from the center's main hall seemed to fade, leaving only the weight of their collective frustration. Mrs. Lopez broke the silence. "You're all right. This isn't just about you, it's about a much bigger problem. What happened today was a symptom of something deeper, and if you're willing, this is a chance to do something about it." "What do you mean?" Danny asked, her tone cautious but curious. Mrs. Lopez leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "This video Aaliyah posted, it's powerful. It's already reaching people, starting conversations. But if you want to create real change, you need to think beyond today's incident. You need to ask, what can we do to make sure this doesn't happen again?" Tyrell sat back, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know where to start." "Start with your story," Mrs. Lopez said simply. "People need to hear what you went through, not just as a group, but as individuals. Share your feelings, your frustrations, and your hopes. Use your voices." Aaliyah nodded slowly, a spark of determination in her eyes. "She's right. The video was just the first step. We can't let it stop there." Over the next hour, the teens and Mrs. Lopez brainstormed ways to turn their experience into action. Aaliyah proposed expanding the video into a larger campaign, sharing their story alongside others who had faced similar treatment. "People are already engaging with what we posted," she said. "If we can show them that this is part of a bigger problem, maybe we can push for change." "Like what kind of change?" Danny asked. "I mean, we're just a bunch of kids. What can we actually do?" "You'd be surprised," Mrs. Lopez said. "Small actions can lead to big results. For starters, we can ask the mall to implement diversity training for their staff. That's a tangible step they can take to prevent something like this from happening again. And we can reach out to the media," Jasmine added. "If more people hear about what happened, it'll put pressure on the mall to take us seriously." Tyrell tapped his fingers against the table, deep in thought. "What about a public apology?" he said finally. "Not just to us, but to everyone who's ever been treated like this at the mall. They need to own up to what happened." Mrs. Lopez smiled. "That's a great idea, but you need to be prepared for pushback. Not everyone's going to be on your side, and some people are going to try to discredit you." "Let them try," Aaliyah said, her voice resolute. "We're not backing down." By the time the group left the community center that evening, they had a clear plan of action. Aaliyah would continue to manage their social media presence, amplifying their story and encouraging others to share their experiences. Jasmine and Tyrell would draft a statement to present to the mall's management, outlining their demands for diversity training and a public apology. Mrs. Lopez would reach out to local news outlets to share their story. Malik, however, felt uneasy. As the group walked toward the bus stop, he hung back, his hands stuffed deep into his pockets. "You okay?" Danny asked, falling into step beside him. "I guess," he said, his voice low. I don't know if this is gonna change anything. What if we do all this and nothing happens?" Danny shrugged, her breath visible in the cold air. "Maybe it won't. But what's the alternative? Doing nothing? Letting people like McAllister get away with it? At least this way we're trying." Malik nodded, though his uncertainty lingered. He wasn't sure if the world was ready to listen to kids like them, but he knew one thing for certain. He didn't want to stay silent. The next morning, Aaliyah's phone buzzed non-stop with notifications. The video had gone viral overnight, amassing hundreds of thousands of views and sparking heated debates across social media. Supporters flooded the comments, praising the teens for their bravery and calling out McAllister's behavior. But there were also detractors, some accusing the group of overreacting, others dismissing their story as a publicity stunt. Tyrell scrolled through the comments with a mix of frustration and determination. "People are really out here defending McAllister," he said, shaking his head. "Like, how do you watch that video and not see the problem?" "Because they don't want to see it," Jasmine said. "Admitting there's a problem means admitting they're part of it." Mrs. Lopez entered the room, holding a printed email. "I've got some news," she said. "The mall's management team wants to meet with us." The room fell silent. "Wait, really?" Danny said, her eyes wide. "What do they want?" "To discuss the incident," Mrs. Lopez said, reading from the email. "They're feeling the pressure, thanks to all the attention your video is getting." Tyrell exchanged a glance with Aaliyah. "So what's the plan?" Mrs. Lopez smiled. "The plan is simple. We walk in there, we tell them our story, and we don't back down." The teens felt a mixture of nerves and excitement as they prepared for the meeting. This was their chance to turn their experience into something bigger, to demand change not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel unwelcome. As they rehearsed their statements, Tyrell couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. They had started the day as a group of kids singing Christmas carols, but now they were something more. They were a force to be reckoned with. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds as Aaliyah sat at her kitchen table, her phone buzzing with a constant stream of notifications. The video she had uploaded was everywhere. Every few seconds, new comments, shares, and reactions rolled in, and her feed was a chaotic mix of outrage and support. Her mom leaned over her shoulder, stirring a cup of coffee. "You've been glued to that thing all morning. What's the verdict? People love you or hate you?" Aaliyah shrugged, a mix of pride and unease flashing across her face. "Both," she admitted. "Some people are really backing us up, saying we're brave for calling it out. But others," she hesitated, scrolling through the comments. "They're saying stuff like, maybe they deserved it, or why were they even there in the first place?" Her mom frowned, setting her mug down. "People will always find a way to justify bad behavior if it makes them feel better about themselves. You just have to focus on the ones who are actually listening." "Yeah," Aaliyah said, though the hateful comments still stung. She scrolled further, her eyes scanning the responses. There were messages from people all over the country, sharing their own stories of being profiled or mistreated. "This happened to me last year at a mall in Atlanta. Security followed me and my friends the whole time we were shopping. I'm so glad you posted this. People need to see what it's like for us just trying to exist in public spaces." Aaliyah's chest tightened as she read, a mixture of anger and responsibility swelling inside her. This wasn't just about her and her friends anymore. It was bigger than that. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call, and she recognized Tyrell's name on the screen. "Hey," she said, picking up. "You seeing this?" he asked without preamble. "The video's everywhere. I just got a DM from a reporter asking if we do an interview." "Same," Aaliyah said. "What do you think? Should we?" Tyrell was silent for a moment. "I think we need to talk to everyone first. This isn't just about us. It's about all of us." "Agreed," Aaliyah said. "Let's meet up at the center later." By the time they all gathered at the community center that afternoon, The video had surpassed 200,000 views. Mrs. Lopez had printed out some of the responses, laying them out on the table like evidence in a courtroom. The teens sat around her, their faces a mixture of pride, anger, and determination. "This is getting big," Mrs. Lopez said, gesturing to the printouts. "And with big attention comes big responsibility. You need to decide how you want to handle this." "We already know what we want," Jasmine said firmly. "McAllister needs to be held accountable. And the mall needs to make sure this doesn't happen again." "Right," Danny said. "But how do we actually make that happen? It's not like they're just going to roll over because a video went viral." "They're already feeling the pressure," Aaliyah said, holding up her phone. "The mall released a statement this morning. It's short and vague, but they're definitely paying attention." Mrs. Lopez read aloud from the statement. "The Willow Grove Mall is committed to creating a welcoming environment for all shoppers and takes these allegations seriously. We are reviewing the incident to ensure proper protocols were followed." "Proper protocols," Malik repeated with a scoff. "That's corporate speak for we're trying to cover our butts. They won't take us seriously unless we demand more," Tyrell said. "We can't let them brush this off like it's nothing." Mrs. Lopez nodded. "You're right. So, what's your next move?" The teens exchanged glances, their determination hardening. Tyrell spoke first. "We need to push for real changes. Diversity training for their staff, a public apology, and something in writing saying they're committed to fixing this." "And what about McAllister?" Jasmine asked. "He can't just get away with what he did." "Agreed," Danny said. "But we can't make it just about him. This is about the system that lets people like him treat us that way and get away with it." Mrs. Lopez smiled, a look of pride lighting up her face. "You're all thinking like leaders," she said. "If you're ready, I can help you put together a formal statement. And we'll make sure the media hears your side of the story." Later that night, as the teens sat together drafting their statement, they received an email from the mall's general manager. It was an invitation to meet and discuss the incident. The email was polite but vague, offering no guarantees or apologies. "What do you think?" Aaliyah asked, reading the email aloud. "Should we go?" "Absolutely," Tyrell said. "If they're willing to meet, we need to show up and make our case." "But we have to be careful," Jasmine added. "They might just be trying to quiet us down without actually doing anything." "Then we don't let them," Danny said firmly. "We go in there, we tell them exactly what we want, and we don't leave until they take us seriously." The group agreed, their resolve growing stronger with each passing hour. They didn't just want an apology, they wanted action, and they weren't going to stop until they got it. The next morning, the group stood outside the mall's office suite, their breaths visible in the cold as they huddled together. The mall's general manager had arranged a meeting to discuss the incident. But the teens weren't naive. They knew this was as much about damage control as it was about addressing their concerns. "Okay," Tyrell said, his voice steady despite the nerves he felt. "We go in there, we stay calm, and we stick to what we talked about. They're not doing us a favor by meeting us. We earned this." "Right," Jasmine said. "We've got this." Mrs. Lopez joined them, a folder of documents in hand. "Remember," she said, her tone firm but encouraging, "you're here to represent not just yourselves, but everyone who's ever been treated unfairly like this. Don't let them shift the focus." The teens nodded, exchanging glances before stepping inside. The office was sleek and impersonal, all glass walls and minimalist decor. A receptionist led them to a conference room where the mall's general manager, a tall woman in a gray blazer, was waiting. To her left sat McAllister, his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Jenkins, the junior officer, was also present, looking uneasy. "Good morning," the general manager said, standing to greet them. "Thank you for coming. My name is Sandra Perez, and I'm the general manager of Willow Grove Mall. I've asked Officer McAllister and Officer Jenkins to join us so we can address this situation fully." The teens took their seats with Mrs. Lopez sitting beside them. Tyrell leaned forward slightly, his hands clasped on the table. "Thank you for meeting with us," he said. We appreciate the opportunity to talk about what happened. Sandra nodded, offering a polite smile. First, I want to acknowledge that the video you posted has raised serious concerns. We're committed to creating an inclusive environment at this mall, and we take your experience very seriously. McAllister shifted in his seat but said nothing. Tyrell glanced at Jasmine, who picked up where he left off. It's not just about us, she said. What happened reflects a bigger problem. People like us, people who look like us, are often treated like we don't belong in spaces like this. That has to change. Sandra nodded again, her expression thoughtful. We understand your concerns, and we're open to hearing your suggestions on how we can improve. Aaliyah leaned forward. First, we want diversity training for your security staff. People like McAllister need to understand how their biases affect the way they interact with others. McAllister bristled, his lips thinning into a hard line. I was just doing my job, he said, his tone defensive. If I hadn't stepped in, who knows what could have happened? What could have happened? Danny said, her voice sharp. We were literally singing Christmas carols. What exactly did you think we were going to do? Steal the tree. Danny, Mrs. Lopez said gently, placing a hand on her arm. No, let her speak, Tyrell said, his gaze fixed on McAllister. We need to hear this. What exactly made you think we were a threat? McAllister shifted uncomfortably but didn't respond. I think what Tyrell is saying, Mrs. Lopez interjected, is that implicit bias is a serious issue, and it played a clear role in this situation. That's why diversity training is so important. Sandra cleared her throat, steering the conversation back on track. We agree that training could be beneficial, and we'll look into implementing it. What else would you like to see happen? A public apology, Jasmine said, from the mall, acknowledging what happened and committing to change. We'll consider that, Sandra said, her tone cautious. No, Aaliyah said, her voice firm. It's not optional. If you're serious about making this right, you need to own up to what happened. Sandra hesitated, glancing at McAllister. He looked ready to protest, but Jenkins spoke up first. Look, Jenkins said, his voice tentative. I don't think anyone here wants this to happen again, and the truth is we could all benefit from better training. Maybe we should start there. Sandra nodded slowly, as if weighing her options. All right, she said. Here's what I propose. We'll implement mandatory diversity training for all security staff. We'll also issue a public statement acknowledging the incident and outlining our plan to improve. The teens exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of relief and skepticism. What about McAllister? Danny asked. What happens to him? Sandra hesitated. Officer McAllister will also participate in the training. Beyond that, any additional actions will be handled internally. It wasn't the complete accountability they'd hoped for, but it was a start. As the meeting wrapped up, the teens left the conference room with a sense of cautious victory. They had stood their ground and secured concrete commitments, but they knew the fight wasn't over. Change wouldn't happen overnight, and it would take continued pressure to ensure the promises made today weren't forgotten tomorrow. Outside the mall, Tyrell exhaled deeply, his breath visible in the cold air. We did it, he said, though his voice lacked the triumph he'd expected to feel. We started it, Jasmine corrected, a small smile tugging at her lips. Now we just have to make sure they follow through. Danny nodded. And if they don't, we'll remind them who they're dealing with. The group laughed softly, their bond stronger than ever. As they headed toward the bus stop, the weight of the day began to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just a group of kids anymore. They were advocates, leaders, and, most importantly, a force for change. The days after the meeting with mall management were a blur of activity. The teens found themselves juggling school, rehearsals, and a growing sense of responsibility to see the commitments made during the meeting turned into action. The buzz surrounding their video hadn't slowed. In fact, it had taken on a life of its own. News outlets continued reaching out, and social media platforms were flooded with discussions about racial bias, fairness, and the power of youth voices. In the small community center auditorium where they practiced, The teens gathered one evening for what Mrs. Lopez called a focused rehearsal. But the tension in the air made it clear this was about more than just music. "I talked to the general manager again this morning," Mrs. Lopez said as she handed out updated sheet music. "They're moving forward with the diversity training, and they'll be releasing their public statement tomorrow." "That's good, right?" Danny asked, adjusting the bow on her violin. "It's progress," Mrs. Lopez said, her tone cautious. "But it's only the beginning. Remember, you're performing again at the mall this weekend. It's part of the statement, an attempt to show they're making things right." Aaliyah snorted. "So, basically, we're the proof that they're not racist anymore." Tyrell raised a hand to calm her. "Maybe, but this performance isn't about them. It's about us. It's about showing everyone what we stand for." "That's true," Jasmine added, her voice thoughtful. "We can use this as an opportunity to remind them why we were there in the first place, to raise money for the shelter." Malik tapped a rhythm on the edge of his drum, his brows furrowed. "But what if McAllister's still around? How are we supposed to perform knowing he's probably watching us, waiting for us to mess up?" "He will be," Mrs. Lopez said, not sugarcoating the truth. "But he's also going through the same scrutiny you are, maybe even more. Let's focus on what you can control. The music and your message." The teens nodded, their determination sharpening. With that, they launched into their first song of the night, a stirring rendition of "Hark, the Herald Angels Sing." As the days passed, the community's support for the teens continued to grow. Local businesses donated supplies for their upcoming performance, and volunteers helped the group design posters and flyers that included information about the homeless shelter they were supporting. Jasmine and Tyrell also worked with Mrs. Lopez to prepare a short speech to deliver at the start of the performance. "We have to remind people why we're doing this," Tyrell said one evening as they huddled over his handwritten notes. "Exactly," Jasmine agreed. "This isn't just about us being treated unfairly. It's about standing up for anyone who's ever been told they don't belong." By the time the weekend arrived, the group was ready, though a lingering sense of unease remained. The mall performance had become a much bigger event than they'd originally planned, with local reporters and community leaders confirming they'd be in attendance. Even the mayor had hinted at making an appearance. On the morning of the performance, the teens arrived at the mall to find the atrium bustling with activity. A large stage had been set up in front of the Christmas tree, complete with professional sound equipment and seating for an audience. Volunteers were busy arranging donation boxes for the shelter, while curious shoppers paused to watch. "This is a lot," Danny said, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "It's what we wanted," Aaliyah reminded her, though even she looked a little overwhelmed. Mrs. Lopez joined them, her hands full of programs for the event. "Take a deep breath, everyone. You've worked hard for this. Now it's time to show them what you can do." As they set up their instruments and did a final sound check, Tyrell couldn't help but glance toward the edges of the atrium. Sure enough, McAllister was there, standing stiffly near a pillar with his arms crossed. Jenkins stood beside him, offering the teens a small, reassuring wave when he caught their eye. "Focus," Tyrell muttered to himself, shaking off the distraction. When the crowd began to settle, Mrs. Lopez stepped onto the stage and tapped the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone," she said, her voice warm and inviting. "We're so glad you could join us today for a very special performance. These incredible young musicians have worked tirelessly to bring you some holiday cheer, all while raising money for an important cause." She paused, glancing back at the teens. "But before they begin, they'd like to share a few words." Tyrell and Jasmine stepped forward, their hands trembling slightly as they took the microphone. "Hi, everyone," Jasmine began, her voice clear and strong. "Thank you for being here today. We're so excited to share our music with you. But first, we want to talk about why we're here." Tyrell nodded, taking over. "We started this group to raise money for the Willow Grove homeless shelter, a place that does so much good for people in need. But along the way, we realized we were doing more than just singing. We were standing up for ourselves, and for everyone who's ever felt like they didn't belong." Jasmine continued, her voice growing more passionate. What happened to us last week was wrong, but we turned it into something right. Today, we're here to celebrate community, resilience, and the power of coming together. The crowd erupted into applause, and the teens exchanged a small, proud smile before stepping back to their instruments. With a nod from Tyrell, Malik began tapping a rhythm on his cajon drum, and the group launched into their first song. As the performance continued, something remarkable happened. The tension that had gripped the teens all week began to melt away, replaced by the joy and connection they felt through their music. Shoppers stopped to listen, children danced near the stage, and donations poured into the collection boxes. Even McAllister seemed to soften as the performance went on. He stood quietly near the back of the crowd, his stern expression replaced by something unreadable. Jenkins leaned over and said something to him, and though McAllister didn't respond, he didn't leave either. By the time the teens finished their final song, "Oh Holy Night," the audience was on their feet, clapping and cheering. Tears glistened in Mrs. Lopez's eyes as she joined the group on stage, embracing each of them in turn. "You did it," she whispered. "You really did it." The teens stood together, their hearts full as they looked out at the crowd. They had turned pain into purpose, and in that moment, they knew their voices had made a difference. As the crowd's applause faded, Tyrell stepped forward to the microphone again. His heart pounded in his chest, but the energy in the atrium gave him the courage to continue. The audience was still watching, waiting for him to speak, and he wasn't going to waste the moment. "Thank you, everyone," he began, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Today, we didn't just sing. We stood for something. For those who've ever felt like they don't belong. For those who've been judged before they had a chance to prove who they are. This performance was for you." The crowd erupted into cheers once more, and Tyrell stepped back, letting Jasmine take over. She clutched the microphone tightly, her usual confidence flickering with vulnerability. "We know this isn't the end," she said, "but it's a start. And with all of you here, supporting us, we know change is possible. Thank you for listening, for believing in us, and for helping us support the Willow Grove Homeless Shelter. Together, we've raised more than we ever thought possible." She gestured toward the donation boxes, now overflowing with cash, checks, and even small notes of encouragement tucked between the bills. A volunteer quickly approached the microphone to announce the total, her voice trembling with excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm thrilled to share that, thanks to all of you, we've raised over $15,000 today." Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by thunderous applause. The teens exchanged wide-eyed looks of disbelief, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. 15,000? Malik whispered, shaking his head in amazement. "We were hoping for, like, a few hundred." "Guess people really showed up for us," Danny said with a grin. Literally and figuratively. The group moved to the edge of the stage, waving and thanking audience members as they began to disperse. Many people stopped to offer words of encouragement or share how moved they were by the teen's story and performance. A few even handed out business cards, promising future opportunities for the group to perform or speak at community events. As the atrium cleared out, Sandra Perez, the mall's general manager, approached the teens with a cautious smile. She extended her hand, which Tyrell hesitated a moment before shaking. "I wanted to congratulate you on an incredible performance," she said, "and thank you for your patience and professionalism throughout this process. I know the past week hasn't been easy." Jasmine crossed her arms, her expression wary. "We appreciate the opportunity to perform," she said carefully, "but we're still waiting to see if the mall is really committed to the changes you promised." Sandra nodded, her face softening. "I understand your concerns. I assure you, we've already scheduled the first round of diversity training for next month, and we're working on a public statement to acknowledge what happened and commit to doing better." "You'll need to do more than just words," Aaliyah said bluntly, her arms crossed. "People are watching now, and they'll hold you accountable." "I hope they do," Sandra replied. "Accountability is what drives progress. Thank you for holding us to a higher standard." Before the teens could respond, Jenkins appeared beside Sandra, his expression sheepish. "Hey," he said awkwardly. "I just wanted to say, you were amazing today, and I'm sorry for everything that happened. I should have spoken up sooner." "We appreciate that," Tyrell said, his voice kind but firm. "But it's not enough to just feel bad about what happened. Next time you see something wrong, say something. Do something." Jenkins nodded, his face red with a mix of embarrassment and determination. "You're right. I will." As they packed up their instruments, the teens noticed McAllister lingering near the edge of the atrium. He looked out of place, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, as though debating whether to approach. Finally, he walked toward them, his expression unreadable. The group tensed slightly, unsure of what to expect. McAllister began, his voice gruff. He cleared his throat, his gaze darting between the teens and the ground. "I just wanted to say I might have misjudged you." Tyrell raised an eyebrow. "Might have?" McAllister's face turned red, and he let out a long breath. "All right, I did. I misjudged you. What you did today, it was good. You're good kids." There was a long pause before Jasmine spoke. "Thanks for saying that," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "But it's not about us being good. It's about treating people fairly, no matter who they are." McAllister nodded stiffly. "Yeah, I get that. Or, I'm trying to." Aaliyah crossed her arms but said nothing, letting the silence hang heavy between them. Finally, McAllister straightened, his discomfort evident. "Good luck with everything," he muttered before walking away. The group watched him leave, their emotions a tangled mix of frustration and cautious hope. "Well, that was something," Danny said, breaking the silence. "Yeah," Tyrell said, "but it's not enough." "It's a start," Jasmine said softly, "and sometimes that's all you can hope for." As they left the mall that evening, the teens were greeted by a crisp winter night and a sky full of stars. Their spirits were lighter, their bond stronger than ever. The events of the past week had tested them in ways they never could have imagined, but they had risen to the challenge, using their voices to create change. "We did good today," Malik said as they waited for the bus. "Not just for the shelter, but for ourselves." "Yeah," Tyrell agreed. "And it's only the beginning." The bus pulled up, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and the group climbed aboard, laughing and talking as they found their seats. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew one thing for certain. Together, they could face anything. The night after their performance, the teens found themselves in the spotlight like never before. News outlets covered their story, social media buzzed with praise, and people from all over the country reached out to express their support. Messages flooded their phones, some from strangers sharing similar stories, others offering words of encouragement, and a few from skeptics questioning the importance of what they'd done. Tyrell sat on the edge of his bed, scrolling through his phone. A tweet caught his eye. "This isn't just about a mall. It's about what we all face every day. These kids are showing us how to fight back with courage and grace." He smiled, feeling a warmth spread through him. For the first time in a week, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. Meanwhile, Aaliyah sat in her room, reviewing the final cut of a video compilation she'd put together. It featured clips from their mall performance interspersed with footage of their earlier confrontation with McAllister. The contrast was striking, raw and undeniable. "This is going to get people talking," she said aloud to herself as she hit the upload button. The next day, Mrs. Lopez called the teens to the community center for an impromptu meeting. They arrived to find her standing in front of a whiteboard covered in notes and diagrams. "What's all this?" Danny asked, setting her violin case down. "This," Mrs. Lopez said, gesturing to the board, "is how we turn what you've done into lasting change." The teens exchanged curious glances as Mrs. Lopez continued. "The response to your performance has been incredible, but we can't let it stop there. This is your chance to make a real difference, not just in our community, but beyond." "How?" Jasmine asked, leaning forward. "By creating a platform," Mrs. Lopez said, "a space where people can share their stories, advocate for change, and hold institutions accountable. You've already started the conversation. Now it's time to keep it going. The teens were quiet for a moment, absorbing the weight of what she was suggesting. Then Tyrell spoke up. I like it, he said, but we have to make sure it's not just talk. It has to lead to action. Exactly, Mrs. Lopez said, nodding. And it starts with you. You're the faces of this movement now, whether you like it or not. People are listening to you. What do you want to say? Over the next week, the teens worked tirelessly to build their platform. With the help of local volunteers and supportive community members, they launched a website and social media pages under the name Voices of Change. The site featured their story, resources for addressing discrimination, and a submission form for others to share their experiences. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Stories poured in from all over. Students who had been unfairly profiled at school, workers who had been mistreated on the job, shoppers who had been followed in stores for no reason other than the color of their skin. Each story added fuel to their fire, reinforcing the importance of what they were doing. One evening, the teens sat together in the community center's lounge, scrolling through the submissions. Danny read one aloud, her voice trembling with emotion. This one's from a guy in Texas, she said. I'm a father of 3, and last week I was stopped in a parking lot because someone thought my car was too nice for someone like me. When I saw your video, I cried. Thank you for standing up for people like us. The room fell silent as the words sank in. We're really doing this, Malik said, his voice filled with awe. We're actually making a difference. Jasmine nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. And we're not stopping. As their platform grew, so did the pressure on the mall. The public statement Sandra Perez had promised was released, along with an announcement that the diversity training for security staff had begun. But the teens weren't satisfied. They need to go further, Aaliyah said during a strategy meeting. It's great they're training their staff, but what about their hiring practices? Their policies? They need to make systemic changes, not just band-aid fixes. I agree, Tyrell said. Let's write an open letter and publish it on our site. We'll lay out exactly what we expect from them, and what happens if they don't deliver. The group worked late into the night, crafting a powerful letter that combined personal stories with actionable demands. When they published it the next morning, it went viral within hours, sparking a fresh wave of conversations and calls for accountability. The pressure worked. A week later, Sandra Perez reached out to schedule another meeting. This time, she came prepared with a comprehensive plan. Updated policies for handling security incidents, a commitment to diversifying their hiring process, and a new partnership with local advocacy groups to ensure accountability. The teens were skeptical at first, but as Sandra laid out the details, they began to feel a cautious optimism. This is a step in the right direction, Tyrell said at the end of the meeting. But we'll be watching to make sure you follow through. And we'll hold you accountable if you don't, Aaliyah added. Sandra nodded, her expression serious. You have my word. That evening, the teens gathered at the community center to celebrate their progress. Mrs. Lopez had brought a cake, and the room was filled with laughter and relief. We've come a long way, Jasmine said, raising her cup in a toast. Here's to everything we've accomplished, and everything we're going to accomplish. To Voices of Change, Tyrell added, raising his cup. To change, Aaliyah said, her voice strong and steady. The cups clinked together, and for the first time in weeks, the teens allowed themselves to relax. They knew there was still a long road ahead, but they also knew they weren't walking it alone. Together, they had turned their pain into power, and they were just getting started. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of progress and reflection. The teens' open letter to the mall had become a symbol of accountability, shared across countless social media platforms and even mentioned in national news outlets. Voices of Change, the initiative they had started, began to grow far beyond their small community. What had once been a reactive effort to address one injustice was transforming into a movement with a life of its own. One crisp morning in late December, Tyrell woke to an email from a producer at a national morning talk show. They wanted to feature the group story on air. He immediately texted the others, and within minutes, their group chat exploded with messages. This is huge, Aaliyah wrote, "I can't believe it. We're going national," Danny added. But with the excitement came a sense of responsibility. "If we're going to do this," Tyrell said during their planning meeting later that day, "we have to make sure we're telling the whole story, not just about us, but about everyone who's shared their experiences with us." The group spent hours preparing for the interview, practicing their talking points and ensuring they represented their community with authenticity and integrity. By the time they stepped onto the studio set in New York City a week later, they were ready. The host, a warm and charismatic woman with a genuine smile, introduced them with a short video summarizing their journey, from the confrontation with mall security to their viral performance and the creation of Voices of Change. "Please welcome the incredible teens who turned a moment of injustice into a movement for progress," the host said as they walked on stage to applause. Seated under the bright studio lights, the teens took turns answering questions about their experiences and the impact they hoped to achieve. Jasmine spoke about the importance of using music as a form of resistance and healing. Malik shared how the stories submitted to their platform had inspired him to think bigger. Aaliyah highlighted the systemic issues they hoped to address through their advocacy. But it was Tyrell's closing statement that struck a chord. "This isn't just about us," he said, his voice steady. "It's about creating a world where no one feels like they don't belong. We want to be the generation that says, 'Enough is enough,' and we're not stopping until we see real change." The audience erupted into applause, and even the host looked visibly moved. "You're an inspiration to all of us," she said. "Thank you for showing the world what courage looks like." After the interview aired, the response was overwhelming. Donations to the Willow Grove homeless shelter skyrocketed, and Voices of Change received thousands of new followers across their platforms. Messages poured in from people of all ages and backgrounds, each one a testament to the power of speaking out. Among the messages was one that stood out to Aaliyah. It was from a young girl in Detroit who wrote, "I was scared to stand up for myself when something like this happened to me, but after seeing what you all did, I feel like I can. Thank you for giving me the courage to use my voice." Aaliyah shared the message with the group, and it reminded them all of why they had started this journey in the first place. On Christmas Eve, the teens gathered once more at the Willow Grove Mall, this time as honored guests. The mall had partnered with Voices of Change to host a community event celebrating diversity, resilience, and the holiday spirit. The atrium was filled with people from all walks of life, united by the warmth of the season and a shared commitment to progress. As they prepared to perform, Tyrell looked out at the crowd and felt a profound sense of peace. He could see familiar faces, volunteers from the homeless shelter, teachers from their school, neighbors who had cheered them on. But there were also strangers, people who had been drawn by their story and wanted to be part of something bigger. Jasmine stepped to the microphone, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found her purpose. "Tonight, we're here to celebrate not just the holidays, but the power of community. This is what happens when we come together to lift each other up." The teens launched into their first carol, "O Come, All Ye Faithful," their voices weaving together in perfect harmony. As they sang, the audience joined in, their collective voices rising to fill the space with a sense of hope and unity. By the time they reached their final song, "Silent Night," there wasn't a dry eye in the room. The crowd swayed gently, their faces lit by the soft glow of candlelight. In that moment, the teens felt the weight of what they had achieved, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever felt unseen or unheard. After the performance, Sandra Perez approached them with a warm smile. "I want to thank you," she said, "not just for your music, but for holding us accountable. You've taught all of us an important lesson." "It's not about teaching," Tyrell said. "It's about making sure no one else has to go through what we did." Sandra nodded. "And we're committed to continuing the work you've started. You have my word." As the event wound down, the teens gathered near the Christmas tree, their instruments packed away and their hearts full. Danny looked around at her friends and smiled. "We did good, didn't we?" "We did more than good," Malik said. "We did something that matters." Tyrell raised an imaginary toast, "To Voices of Change, and to making even more noise in the new year." The others laughed and joined in, their voices ringing out like the carols they had sung. Together, they had turned a moment of pain into a movement of progress, proving that even the smallest voices could create the loudest echoes. And as they stood beneath the glowing lights of the tree, they knew their journey was only just beginning.